The man on the platform folded his paper and walked away while the whole town watched. So why did the tall cowboy across the street wait until she didn't move before asking just one quiet question? The train had already pulled out, leaving the rails humming under the cold wind, and Nora stood with her bag at her feet while a few voices carried just enough to be heard. No one stepped in. No one stayed. Then boots crossed the dirt behind her, slow, deliberate, and stopped close enough to matter. She didn't turn until he spoke. "Can you cook?" he asked, like that was the only thing worth knowing. She lifted her bag before answering, steady, measured, as if the choice had already been made somewhere inside her. The wind pressed against her back, the town waiting to see if she would break or walk. Would you have answered him or turned away? The train pulled away without looking back. Steam drifted low across the boards, then thinned into the cold air, leaving the platform too quiet for a place that had just held so many eyes. Nora Hayes stood where the last step had set her down. Her boots hadn't moved since. Dust clung to the hem of her dress. One small leather bag rested by her feet, the handle worn smooth from use. A man from the telegraph office had done the speaking for the groom. He'd kept his hat on while he read the message. Didn't look at her much. When he finished, he folded the paper like it mattered, nodded once and stepped aside. No apology. No second thought. A couple of men near the hitching rail let out a low breath that might have been a laugh. A woman tugged her shawl tighter and turned away. Within a minute, Ridgefall went back to its business. Boots on wood, a wagon rolling slow past the general store, a screen door snapping shut somewhere down the street. Nora stayed. Her hands hung loose at her sides, fingers still from the cold or from something deeper. She kept her chin level. Not high, not lowered, just level. The kind of stillness that looks like choice if you don't stand close enough to see the effort in it. Across the road, a man stood on the edge of the boardwalk outside the hardware store. He didn't move with the others, didn't whisper, didn't stare the way some did, quick and sideways. He just stood there, tall enough to catch the light above the awning, broad in the shoulders under a dust-colored coat. His hat sat low, shadowing most of his face. One hand rested on a paper-wrapped bundle of iron fittings. The other hung easy by his side. Ethan Cole had been there longer than most. He watched the empty space where the train had been. Then he watched the bag at Nora's feet. Then, finally, he looked at her. Not long, not short. Long enough to see she hadn't broken. He stepped off the boardwalk. His boots crossed the packed dirt of the street without hurry. A wagon slowed for him. He didn't look at the driver. He didn't look at the faces turning again. Curious now for a different reason. He climbed the 2 steps to the platform and stopped a pace away from her. Up close, he was taller than she'd thought, not in a way that filled the space with threat, more like something that had been built to carry weight and had learned not to show it. His eyes dropped to the bag once, then lifted. "Can you cook?" he asked. That was all. No, ma'am. No, are you all right? No reaching for the story that had just been laid out in front of the whole town like a torn letter. Nora didn't answer right away. The wind slid along the platform and caught a loose strand of her hair. It brushed her cheek and settled. She bent just enough to pick up her bag, straightening again before she spoke. "I can keep people fed," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't carry past them, but it didn't shake. Ethan gave a small nod, like a man who'd heard what he needed. "Then you can work." He turned as if the matter had been settled somewhere he didn't need to explain. No offer dressed up as kindness. No promise. Just a direction. Nora looked once down the length of the platform. The rails cut through the town and out into land that didn't ask questions either. For a second, it might have seemed like she was measuring distance, or deciding if standing still was a kind of answer. Then she stepped forward. She didn't wait for him to lead. She moved past him, boots steady on the boards, and down the steps to the street. The leather bag knocked lightly against her leg with each step. Ethan watched her go ahead of him. Not surprised, not pleased, just taking note. He followed at a distance that left space between them. Enough for a stranger. Not so much that it looked like he'd changed his mind. They passed the general store. Lydia behind the counter paused with a ledger open, eyes flicking up and then down again. The blacksmith's hammer slowed once against the anvil. A dog lifted its head from the shade and then settled it back on its paws. No one called out. At the edge of town, the buildings gave way to scrub and low fences, posts leaning a little where the wind had worked them over time. The road turned to packed earth, rutted from wagons and spring rain long gone. Beyond it, the land rose in dry hills, pale and wide under a sky that didn't bother to soften itself. A pair of horses waited near a split-rail fence. One was already saddled. The other stood easy, reins looped over the post, breath steady in the cool air. Ethan stepped ahead then, not to take the lead so much as to do what needed doing. He checked the cinch, ran a hand along the horse's neck, and adjusted the stirrup a notch lower. Nora stopped beside the second horse. She didn't reach for it right away. Up close, the leather smelled of use, not new, not neglected, the kind of gear that had been kept working. She set her bag down on the ground, opened it just enough to tuck the strap inside so it wouldn't catch, then closed it again. Ethan glanced once at her hands. Clean, though the nails were worn. A small scar along the knuckle of her left index finger. He looked away before it could become a question. He didn't offer to lift her. He just steadied the horse. Nora placed her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up in one smooth motion. She sat straight in the saddle, adjusting her skirt with a quick, practiced movement. When she took the reins, she didn't fumble. Ethan mounted his own horse. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The town lay behind them, already shrinking into something that would be talked about by supper and forgotten by morning. Ethan nudged his horse forward. Nora followed. The wind picked up as they left the last fence behind. It carried the dry scent of grass and dust and something colder rolling down from the higher ground. The road stretched ahead without promise, only direction. After a while, Ethan looked back just enough to see if she was keeping pace. She was. He faced forward again. They rode like that, two figures on an open road, not bound by anything said out loud. Behind them, Ridgefall settled into its day. Ahead, the land widened. Nora shifted her grip on the reins once, feeling the leather warm under her fingers. She didn't look back. The road climbed slow, bending through dry hills where the grass came in thin patches and the wind never quite settled. The sun had dropped lower by the time the ranch came into view, stretched wide against the land like something built to last more by habit than design. Stone Ridge. A split-rail gate hung slightly off-center. One hinge creaked when Ethan pushed it open. He didn't look at it, just rode through and let it fall back into place behind them. The yard was hard-packed dirt. A water trough sat near the barn, ringed with hoof marks. Two men were working a fence line to the east, hammering posts back into ground that didn't want to hold them. They paused when they saw Ethan ride in. Their eyes moved to Nora without comment, then back to their work. Ethan dismounted first. He tied his horse to the rail and crossed toward the house. No announcement, no introduction. He opened the door and stepped inside, leaving it ajar behind him. Nora slid down from the saddle. Her boots hit the ground steady. She untied her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and followed. Inside, the air held the faint smell of wood smoke and coffee gone cold. The room was plain. Table, 2 chairs, a stove against the far wall with a dented kettle resting on top. A shelf lined with mismatched tin plates. Nothing soft, nothing extra. Ethan moved to the stove and lifted the kettle, checking it without much interest. He set it back down and nodded toward a narrow doorway off to the side. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "What's in it is what you've got." Nora stepped past him. The kitchen was smaller than she expected. A rough counter, a basin with a hand pump, a narrow window that looked out toward the barn. A sack of flour leaned in the corner. A few jars sat on the shelf, beans, salt, something pickled. A knife lay on the counter, blade dulled to a soft edge. She set her bag down by the wall and rolled her sleeves once. Behind her, boots sounded on the floorboards. A man stepped into the doorway, older, with a face that had settled into one expression and stayed there. Brett Dawson. He took in the room first, then her. "This the help?" he asked, not to her. Ethan didn't answer right away. He leaned one shoulder against the frame, arms loose at his sides. "She works the kitchen," he said. Brett nodded once, like that told him enough. Or maybe nothing at all. "We'll see," he said, and turned back out. Another figure passed by behind him. Younger. Caleb Price. He slowed just enough to look in, eyes sharp, then moved on without a word. Nora reached for the knife. She ran her thumb lightly along the edge, then set it flat and found a stone near the basin. The sound of metal against grit filled the room, steady and quiet. Outside, the wind shifted. By dusk, the sky had gone the color of worn steel. The men came in one by one, boots dragging a little from the day. They took their places at the table without asking what there would be. Nora set down a pot. Beans stretched thin, a pan of bread baked low and slow. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. They ate. No one spoke at first. Spoons against tin, the scrape of chair legs, the low crack of the stove behind them. Ethan sat at the end of the table. He didn't rush, didn't linger either. He ate what was in front of him, then set his spoon down. His eyes moved once across the table, not at her, but through the room. "Salt's there," someone muttered. Another man nodded, reaching for it without looking up. That was all. When they finished, the men stood and went back out into the cooling air. No one commented. No one complained. Ethan stayed a moment longer. He picked up the empty pot, turned it slightly in his hands, as if weighing something that wasn't written on it, then set it back down where she could reach it. "Up early," he said. Nora nodded. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The room settled again. Nora washed the dishes in silence. The water ran cold at first, then warmer as she worked the pump. She wiped each plate dry and stacked them in a straighter line than they'd been before. She folded the cloth and set it near the edge of the counter. When she reached for the knife again, she tested the edge. It caught just enough. She left it there. The next morning came with a pale light through the window and frost along the edges of the glass. Nora was already awake. The fire had burned low overnight. She crouched by the stove and coaxed it back to life, feeding it small pieces of wood until the flame held. Footsteps sounded outside. A door opened somewhere near the barn. Ethan stepped in carrying a sack over one shoulder. He set it down near the wall without ceremony. Flour. He didn't look at her when he did it, just brushed his hands together and reached for the coffee pot. Nora glanced once at the sack, then back to the stove. Nothing was said. But something had shifted. Outside, the fence still leaned. The wind still moved the same way across the hills. The ranch hadn't changed. Inside, the room held a different kind of quiet. Not empty, just waiting. The morning held that feeling longer than it should have. Frost clung to the fence posts, thin and stubborn. the kind that didn't melt right away, even after the sun found it. Nora stood at the basin, sleeves rolled, hands deep in cold water. She moved slow, not from hesitation, but because nothing in the house asked for speed. Outside, the ranch had already begun. Boots on dirt, a gate swinging open, the low shift of cattle somewhere past the rise. Ethan's voice carried once, not loud, just enough to turn a man in the right direction. Then something broke that rhythm. A sharp crack, not wood, not metal. A horse's startled cry followed it. Everything stopped. Nora's hands came out of the water before the thought finished forming. She wiped them once on her skirt and stepped through the back door into the yard. 2 men were already running. Brett came out of the barn at a half pace, not fast, not slow. The kind of movement that saves energy for what comes next. On the far side of the corral, a young hand lay on the ground, half turned, one arm drawn tight against his body. The horse had backed away, sides heaving, eyes wide and white. No one touched the man yet. They circled, looked, waited. "Don't move him," someone said, though no one had tried. Nora crossed the yard without calling out. She stepped through the open rail and dropped to her knees beside him. The dirt was cold through the fabric. The man's breath came short, uneven, like something inside him couldn't find the right place to settle. "Hey," she said, low, not to calm him, just to anchor him somewhere. His eyes found hers for a second, then drifted. She didn't ask what happened. Her hands moved. She checked his shoulder first. The angle wasn't right, not clean, not broken through, but wrong enough to matter. She pressed lightly along the bone, watching his face more than her own hands. "Stay with me," she said. He didn't answer. Behind her, Boots approached. "Ethan." He didn't step in. Not yet. Nora reached for the edge of her sleeve and tore a strip free in one steady motion. The sound cut through the air. She folded the cloth, set it under the man's arm, then adjusted his position with care that looked like certainty, not guesswork. "Hold him," she said, without turning. There was a pause. Then Ethan stepped forward. He crouched opposite her, one knee in the dirt. His hands settled where she indicated, firm but not forcing. He didn't ask how, didn't question, just followed the line she set. Together, they shifted the arm. The man gasped once, sharp and short. Then his breathing changed. Slower. Still uneven, but no longer fighting itself. Nora tied the cloth tight enough to hold, loose enough to let blood move. "Don't let him get up," she said. Brett nodded once from behind them, already turning to clear space. The rest of the men stepped back. The horse had settled. The yard found its sound again, though quieter now. Ethan stayed where he was a moment longer, watching the man's chest rise and fall. Then he looked at Nora. Not long, just enough to see she wasn't finished. She sat back on her heels, hands resting lightly on her knees. No shaking, no rush. The man on the ground blinked up at the sky, then toward her again, as if trying to place where he'd been pulled back from. "You're all right," she said. It wasn't comfort. It was a statement. He nodded once. Slow. By afternoon, the story had already left the ranch. It reached the general store before the sun dipped. By evening, it had found its way to the church steps, where words traveled easier than wind. A man came out the next day. Pastor Hale. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, turning at once as he looked around. His eyes landed on Nora where she stood near the pump, rinsing out a cloth. "Ma'am," he said, polite enough, "I hear you've been helping." Nora wrung the water from the fabric and hung it over the line. The wind caught it and pulled it straight. "I did what needed doing," she said. He nodded, though it didn't quite settle his curiosity. And before here? She met his eyes for a moment. Before here doesn't change what you saw. That held him longer than her first answer. He glanced toward the house where Ethan moved along the porch, checking the boards without looking like he was listening. Pastor Hale cleared his throat once, then set his hat back on his head. Well, he said, that's fair enough. He left the way he came. That evening, the light in the kitchen held longer. The stove burned steady. The smell of something simple, beans again, but better set this time, filled the room. Nora moved between counter and stove without hurry. A small figure appeared in the doorway. He didn't step in right away. 7, maybe. Thin. Hair that hadn't decided which way to settle. Liam. He leaned against the frame, watching. Nora didn't turn. You can come in, she said. He pushed off the wood and took 2 steps inside, then stopped again, as if there was a line he hadn't been told about. She set a cup on the table, poured water into it, pushed it a little closer to the edge. Liam walked to it, picked it up with both hands. Drank. He didn't say thank you. She didn't ask him to. When the men came in, he was already sitting at the corner of the table, quiet as if he'd always been there. Ethan noticed. He didn't comment. He took his place, ate, set his spoon down the same as before. But when he stood, his hand rested for a second on the back of the empty chair beside him, not gripping it, just there, like he was marking something. Then he let it go. Outside, the wind moved through the fence line again, the same as yesterday, the same as it would tomorrow. Inside, something had changed, not enough to name, but enough to stay. The days settled into a pattern that didn't need explaining. Morning came early, coffee before light. The stove catching slow, then steady. Nora moved through the kitchen without wasted motion. Liam was there most days now, not asking, just arriving. He took the same seat each time, hands folded around a tin cup, watching the way she worked like it was something worth learning. Ethan passed through the room the same way each morning, hat low, coat already dusted from the yard. Sometimes he paused long enough to take a cup. Sometimes he didn't. But he always looked once, not at the food, at the room, like he was checking if it still held. By the end of the week, the fence line had been set straight. The horses were quieter in the mornings. Even Brett stopped standing in the doorway quite so long before stepping in. It didn't go unnoticed. It didn't get spoken either. Then the wind changed. It came in sharper that morning, cutting down from the hills with a kind of edge that carried things farther than it should. Sound traveled different in it. Nora heard the horse before she saw it. Fast, not reckless, but driven. She stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a cloth she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan was already in the yard, one hand resting on the gate as he watched the road. The rider didn't slow until he reached the yard. The horse stopped hard, breath coming in quick bursts. Dust settled slow behind him. The man swung down with less care than the distance had asked for. He straightened his coat, pulled a folded set of papers from inside it, and looked around like he expected to be recognized. Nora didn't need the introduction. Something in the way he held the paper told her enough. She was promised, he said, loud enough to carry past the yard and into the open land beyond. No one answered right away. Brett stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. Caleb paused near the fence, hammer still in his grip. Liam stood just inside the doorway behind Nora, quiet, watching. Ethan didn't move. The man took a step forward, holding the papers up like they had weight beyond what they were. Signed and witnessed, he said. Agreement don't just vanish because someone finds a softer place to land. The wind pulled at the edges of the document, snapping at once before settling. Nora stayed where she was. She didn't step back, didn't step forward. Her hands rested at her sides, the same way they had on the platform. Not clenched, not loose, just still. The man looked at her then, properly this time. "You remember me," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer. Ethan's hand left the gate. He walked past the man without brushing him. Not close enough for that. Just near enough to make it clear he wasn't stopping. "Stay here," he said, not looking at Nora. It wasn't an order. It was a direction. He crossed the yard, stepped through the gate, and headed down the road toward town. The man laughed once, sharp. "That right?" he called after him. "You think you can buy your way out of a contract?" Ethan didn't turn. The sound of his boots faded into the wind. The yard held still. No one spoke. Brett shifted his weight once, then settled again. Caleb leaned the hammer against the post and folded his arms. Liam moved closer to Nora, not touching, just near enough to be part of the same space. The man with the papers looked around, expecting something to give. Nothing did. Time stretched. 5 minutes, maybe less. Maybe more. The wind moved the same way through the fence line. The horses shifted in their pen. A loose board tapped once against the side of the barn. Then footsteps. Ethan came back through the gate, slower this time. Not tired, just measured. He carried a small leather pouch in one hand. He stopped in front of the man. Close enough now that the paper didn't matter as much. Ethan didn't reach for it. He opened the pouch instead. Coins, folded bills, everything in it. He held it out. The man looked down at it, then back up, confusion breaking through whatever confidence he'd ridden in with. "What's this supposed to be?" Ethan's voice didn't rise. "Whatever you think this was," he said, "it ends here." The man didn't take it right away. Ethan didn't pull his hand back. For a second, the only sound was the wind working its way through the boards. Then the man reached out. His fingers closed around the pouch. "Ethan, let go. That don't make her yours," Ethan added, almost as an afterthought. The man frowned, still looking at what he'd been given. "It releases her," Ethan said. Silence followed that. The kind that settles over a place when something has shifted in a way no one can quite name yet. The man glanced at Nora again. Whatever he'd expected to see wasn't there. He folded the papers once, slower this time, and slid them back into his coat. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode out the way he'd come. No one watched him go. Ethan stood where he was for a moment longer, his hand empty now. Then he turned. Not to the others, to her. He didn't step closer. Didn't reach. Just met her eyes once, steady and unhurried. "You don't owe me anything," he said. The wind moved between them. The yard held. Nothing rushed in to fill the space, and for the first time since the train had left her standing on that platform, the choice didn't feel like something taken from her. It felt like something waiting to be made. No one moved. The wind came down from the hills and crossed the yard like it always had, carrying dust and the faint smell of dry grass. It brushed past Nora's dress, tugged lightly at the hem, then moved on as if nothing here mattered more than anything else. Ethan stood where he was, not closer, not farther. His hands hung at his sides, empty now. The pouch was gone. Whatever he had saved, whatever had taken years to put together, had left his hand without a second thought. He didn't look at the road where the man had gone. He didn't look at the others either. Just her. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It came slow, not heavy, just enough to loosen something that had been tight for too long. Behind her, the screen door creaked open a fraction. Liam had pushed it with his shoulder. He didn't step out, just stood there, watching with the kind of stillness that belonged to children who had learned to wait before asking anything. Brett shifted his weight once near the barn. Caleb picked his hammer back up, then set it down again, as if unsure whether the moment allowed for work to continue. No one spoke. Nora looked past Ethan, out toward the fence line. The posts stood straighter than they had a week ago. The ground still dry, the wind still the same. Nothing about the land had changed, only the place she stood in it. She stepped down from the porch. One step, then another. Her boots pressed into the dirt, leaving marks that would fade by morning. She stopped halfway between the house and the gate, not close enough to reach Ethan, not far enough to be separate. He didn't move to meet her. That mattered. It left the space hers. "I stayed once," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him, "because I had nowhere else to go." The words settled between them. No one interrupted. She looked at the ground for a moment, then back up, not at his face, but at the line of his shoulders, the way he held himself like he was ready to take weight without asking what it was. "This time," she went on, and paused just long enough to make it clear the pause was hers, "I decide." The wind shifted again. Ethan nodded once, not in approval, not in relief, just acknowledgement. "That's the only way it holds," he said. "Nothing more." Nora turned then, not toward the road, not toward the open land, back to the house. She walked past him without brushing his sleeve, close enough that she could have, if she'd chosen. Close enough that he could have reached out, if he'd been that kind of man. He didn't. She stepped onto the porch, pushed the door open with her hand, and went inside. The kitchen held its quiet the same way it had the morning before. The stove still warm, the cup Liam had left on the table still half full, the knife resting where she had sharpened it days ago, edge catching the light just enough to show it was ready. Liam moved to the table as she entered. He didn't ask anything. He just sat. Nora crossed the room and set her hand on the back of the chair for a moment, before pulling it out and sitting down across from him. She reached for the cup, turned it once, then set it back where it had been. Outside, boots sounded on the porch. A pause. Then the door opened again. Ethan stepped in. He closed it behind him with a quiet push, not the kind that made a point, just enough to keep the wind out. He didn't cross the room right away. He stood near the door, hat still on, eyes taking in the same space he always checked. The table, the stove, the shelf. Nora sitting there, Liam watching both of them like something important had just happened, even if he didn't have the words for it. Ethan moved forward then, not to her, to the table. He set his hand down on the wood, a few inches from hers, not touching, not reaching, just there. The distance between them was small enough to matter. Nora didn't move her hand away. She didn't close the distance either. For a moment, that was enough. Liam picked up his cup and took a sip, eyes dropping to the table like he'd decided the room was safe again. Outside, the wind kept moving through the fence line. The horses shifted in their pen. Somewhere beyond the hills, the day went on the way it always had. Inside, nothing needed to be said. The house didn't ask questions, and for the first time, it didn't feel like it was waiting for answers either. It simply held what was there, and that was enough. The house stayed quiet long after the wind moved on. Out there, the land didn't change for anyone. Fences leaned, seasons turned, and men kept riding the same roads whether they were welcomed or not. But inside that small kitchen, something had settled into place. Not because it was given, not because it was promised, but because it was chosen. Nora had stepped off a train with nothing but a name that meant less than it should have. She wasn't rescued. She wasn't claimed. She was given space, and she decided what to do with it. And Ethan, he never tried to hold her there. That was the difference. A man who could have taken control of the moment chose instead to step back and let it belong to her. Sometimes that's what strength looks like. Not louder, not bigger, just steady enough to carry something without closing a hand around it. Out on that ranch, love didn't arrive all at once. It showed up in small things. In a chair left where someone might sit. In a hand placed near another, not over it. In the kind of silence that didn't demand answers. And maybe that's the part that stays with you, because sooner or later, we all stand somewhere like that. Between what we lost and what we might choose next. So tell me, if you were standing in Nora's place, would you have stayed? And if stories like this stay with you a little longer than they should, there are more waiting just up the road.